Good evening. We have a very special chat today, and I think my microphone might be playing up. Yeah, I don't know. I hope you can hear me. If anybody's out there to hear me, then please let me know. So, we are here today to talk about our experience, really, of playing under your capable guidance, Thomas, Harlem Unbound, which is a Cthulhu sourcebook, a very good one, and playing that with the Vaesen Rules. And Mohammed, who's also playing with us, is also in the chat, so I'm sure he can chip in a few questions, comments, and remarks. Can actually probably annoy us and heckle us from the back row there. So, what is it like? I mean, why did you first come on, up with the idea to say, actually, I like to run Harlem Unbound, but I want to do it in Vaesen? Yeah, I like it as well.
Elements, but also then brought them to life through the modules.
I just got a clue. I couldn't hear the beginning of your answer because I hadn't clicked one button. So you have to try that again. Sorry. So why did you start running? You're truly in the hands of professionals here. So why did you start running a Harlem Unbound in Vaesen? Yeah.
So like I was saying, so I think it's a two-parter answer. So the first part of the answer was I really loved everything about Harlem Unbound. I think it's a work of true genius. I think Chris Spivey has done literally the best job I've ever seen in any sort of source material in describing the social and historical reality of African-American experience in the period. And I think it does, I can't describe how brilliant it is other than to say it is. And then I think he's woven through that a series of modules that give you the opportunity to really explore those topics within the context of Harlem, obviously. So if you were setting similar stories in the South, you'd be telling quite different stories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it would be.
They wouldn't be similar at all. They'd be very different. And they'd be much, I suspect, brutally much tougher to run and to play. And then I find Call of Cthulhu to be a brilliant system, but I hate the probability issue that comes with the percentiles.
This one here.
And I own all of those books, and I really like them. They're beautiful, and I love reading them. But
yeah,
I have GM'd not just enough Cthulhu to decide that I hate the sort of, and we were talking about it before, I hate the fact that a character has 60% chance of success, but then they need a hard success, and now it's 30%, and then they need that times 3. So your now probability of success is what, 9% or 6 or something? Like it's so small. And yet the biggest and most important clue might be hidden behind that issue.
It's this gating of clues that I really didn't like either in Cthulhu. And whenever I play it, and I do play it regularly, it can be quite frustrating. And then the GM always comes up with something. He says, make an intelligence roll, or so he can feed us the clues nonetheless, even though we didn't roll well enough. But that's actually, I started looking at Trail of Cthulhu instead, because I quite like that approach of there. But why Vaesen? Why did you choose Vaesen?
I think two things. One, I really do like Vaesen as a system, so it had an unfair advantage in that I'd run a number of Vaesen modules and I've written something for Vaesen.
My main job here is to hold books up, so I'm going to do that as well.
Okay, very nice.
This one,
I've actually, I've written stuff for Vaesen. I've GM'd a fair amount of it, so I know it. Two, I actually like. So the other complaint you could make about Call of Cthulhu, which I think does translate to a lesser extent to Trail of Cthulhu, is just the sheer number of skills.
Yeah.
So you spend a lot of time saying, I have this unique skill. Now, Trail of Cthulhu handles that quite mechanically. It says, well, here's the spread of skills between the number of players, divide the number of points, and then make sure everyone has at least 1 point in every skill, right?
Yeah.
So it actually has a mechanical way of treating with that. But it is a very long way to treat with that. It's like saying, well, couldn't you just make it easier and kind of glad hand that a bit? And
have fewer skills.
Yeah, but what it does is it says, no, we'll own the skills. The other thing is I like the simplicity of the Vaesen system. I like a single dice pool with a single dice roll with, one success required. I like the fact that conditions control most of the negative impacts, both of pushing and of fear and of damage. Like, all of that is handled quite simply and elegantly through a single mechanic. So when you're playing, you spend way less time worrying about the mechanics of the system and way more time talking about what your character's doing, to be really unkind.
Yeah.
And actually, that's the beauty of those systems, right? So the simpler systems, you spend more time in the narrative and less time looking up exactly what skill or exactly how that skill works or exactly what you've got to do. And so I like that a lot. And for something like Cthulhu, I think that's really important, actually.
The immersion, yeah, you don't want to be taken out of it to say, have I got a hard success as an extreme success? I can't quite work out what I got. And I think that's the immersion break. And if you just have a quick roll and say, yeah, I've got one success, I've got two successes, much quicker to see the sixes, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you either push or you don't.
Yeah, the push mechanic, of course, does exist in Cthulhu as well.
It does. That is fair. And it's pretty brutal. If I remember correctly. Yeah, that's right. Because if you push and you fail, then you get then the GM who's described the negative consequence gets to deploy the negative consequence upon you. I've
done it a few times. I normally end up being the driver for whatever reason. My character is always the driver. He's Logan Lonergan. And driving is a bit Nash, actually. It's a Nash. And for whatever reason, whenever he's driving, somebody tries to hijack the car or shoot us or whatever, including my passengers. Yeah, so he's been shot by his own passenger before. Lots of things. It's always that, and it's always like, you can push the roll, right? So if I push the roll, I end up against a tree or something. So I spent a lot of time in hospital already, but at least I'm still alive. So Reluctant Arts is also putting in the comments to say just with the conditions in Vaesen. One of them is called Angry. And he says it can be quite a good idea to just rename that, almost rebadge it, and just call it Frustrated. But however you act them out, because in Cthulhu, the way it works, you basically just lose sanity. And then if you lose a certain amount of sanity in a day or in a roll, then you have got some consequences. Whereas here, you as a player get to choose which of the conditions you tick and how you roleplay it. So I quite like that as well.
And look, it's been said previously, not by me, but by others, the sanity mechanic in Cthulhu is probably not quite so kosher anymore, for want of better language.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Comes from an age where things kind of were glad-handed. And I've read, is it Ken Height's sort of conversation on sanity in Trail of Cthulhu, I think, where he kind of says, look, it's a game mechanic and sometimes you just need to build a bridge, in effect. I mean, that's all well and true, but Vaesen does neatly dodge that entire bullet.
It does. So, and if I remember correctly, Trail of Cthulhu actually has stability and sanity, and they're separate.
It does.
So rather than actually sort of splitting the problem out a little bit, it actually makes it more complicated.
Yeah, but I think so.
One of the...
I mean, that's the issue with Trail for me.
Yeah. One of the things in Cthulhu is the slow slide into whatever you want to call it, losing your mind. Yeah. Is that something Vaesen can actually do?
Nowhere near as well. So let's be completely honest. When you bring a Cthulhu module or even campaign across to Vaesen, you are accepting certain changes in the way the narrative is going to work. I think Vaesen doesn't, and this is the disadvantage, right? So Vaesen doesn't do as good a job of capturing that kind of the universe is broken and we're irrelevant, and therefore at some point towards the end of this campaign, you're going to suddenly have this moment of realization that you mean nothing in the universe, which is kind of the whole point of Cthulhu. So, in some ways,
cosmic horror, yeah.
We're kind of undermining the fundamental premise of the games, of the narrative. So I think Vaesen can't do that as well. Now, Vaesen can do criticals. You can have mental health. You can have criticals arising from being broken in those two mental spaces. So when your conditions, you burn them all out. But it's not going to be the same. and I don't think it's intended to be the same, because
it's
it
meant
doesn't
to be more
have
optimistic.
that inching towards,
Yeah.
you know, what Sanity does do very well is it gives you a clear signpost that you're inching towards collapse, right? And I don't think Vaesen does that, because it's you roll a table, you suffer effectively a mental damage crit, and then you can roll for an insight to see if you get an insight, or you can get a negative condition as well.
You can, and that can be longer lasting as well. So,
yeah,
but it doesn't quite map it, as you say. And one of the things I was wondering is maybe a little tweak somewhere to have a declining roll there. So, for example, you start with a D12 whenever you have a sanity roll equivalent, and on a 1 or 2 it goes down by 1 die size. You know, like the resource dice in Forbidden Lands. So that you're more and more likely, as you slide towards losing your mind, to actually then suffer the consequences, because you might end up on a D6, or maybe even use a D4 for this one. And then 1 in 4 times that you actually face something and you have a fear, you don't pass your fear test, that you could actually have some sort of consequence, some involuntary action. But yeah, I'm not quite sure. Have you actually hacked any of the rules to say Vaesen needs to change this or that?
No. So I probably accept a degree of change in that core when I run it. Because I wasn't trying to create a Cthulhu system. Is probably the difference, right?
Yeah, there's one coming from your zero, isn't there? Your zero.
Oh, one day. How many years in is it? 4. Anyway, whatever. No complaints. So I don't really mind, but it is funny. So, and also, I don't. This is going to sound particularly specific, but in Harlem Unbound, I'm influenced. Noting that it was written by a white guy, which I didn't find out until reasonably recently. I'm kind of influenced in the aesthetic of Arkham. What was it called? Arkham Country. The one about the African American. There was first of all a novel, and then there was the TV show about the African American family who get sort of wrapped into this whole corrupted story. And the whole point is their experience is already, kind of pretty bleak, and the whole aesthetic behind the story is it's them reconquering the narrative that H.P. Lovecraft, who it should be agreed was an incredibly racist man.
Yep.
So it's about them not only sort of taking on that narrative, but actually recapturing it and repurposing it
it is
from
Arkham.
an African American perspective.
It is Arkham Country, yeah.
Yeah, and I love that story. I loved the TV show. I thought they both did a really good job, once again, of transferring that experience of African American.
I might have to watch that. I haven't actually watched any of it.
It's really good. And there's, in the book anyway, there's this great line about, right towards the end of the story, they're kind of challenged on the basis of, surely you're scared of all the monsters. And, the kind of response from the characters, paraphrased, is, sorry, it's literally deadly for us to be driving across certain counties at night because the police will pull us over and shoot us. So why do you think we should be worried about, otherworldly horror? So I take that aesthetic on board when I run the game for Harlem Unbound. So it's got a slightly more optimistic bent. I mean, there's still terrible people doing terrible things, but the characters themselves aren't inevitably drawn to failure.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. I actually comment from Reluctant Artsy, first of all, which is that the theme is quite different in Vaesen, in that it is the cognitive dissonance, as he puts it, between the spiritual and the technical advancement in humanity, and the abandonment of tradition, the sort of moving away from almost this type of animism to say, okay, the world around us is full of spirits, to, no, that's all nonsense, and we are an industrial society. That is not really what Cthulhu is about.
No, I don't think you're trying to mirror that into the Cthulhu setting. So that conflict, because the thing about Vaesen is it is possible, and I mean, once again, reflecting on explicitly what was in my head when I wrote the Japanese stuff, you like the characters are actually challenged by the idea of finding a way through that explicitly does not necessarily end in the defeat of one or the other of the sides.
Finding a compromise.
Right? It's a completely valid response to find the compromise. Cthulhu has no such concept, and in Harlem Unbound in particular, just once again referring to it, there is no such compromise.
Yeah.
The bad guys are the bad guys, the good guys are the good guys. Do you know what I mean?
At least in the modules
we've run.
Yeah.
Oh no, I think because actually I think none of that is in the mechanics of the game. So I guess the real answer to the question is there's nothing in Vaesen that explicitly is mechanically aligned to that. That is all about how you play the game and how your characters operate. It's actually not something that you have in the game mechanic somewhere that you would have to then treat with to be able to run Cthulhu. In the same way that Sanity is embedded in Call of Cthulhu.
It is. Yeah, it is. A couple of other questions. One, I have to say, and careful not to say the name too often, because it's Beetlejuice or Betelgeuse. Why Vaesen and not Alien or the Coriolis rule set? I mean, Coriolis, I probably would say it's one further away, but Alien could work.
If you were running a one-shot horror story, then
cinematic.
Yeah, the cinematic style, then yeah, you could. Absolutely. No reason why you wouldn't.
Because the stress could work quite nicely there.
But what Alien doesn't have anywhere near as well as Vaesen, and where I would draw the line, is investigative capability. So Alien has one investigation skill. That's it. The sum total of your investigation ability is all locked up in observation. Yeah. So everything you do that is about exploring clues, about finding things out, about seeing things you didn't see, about reading how people are behaving, I guess you can use manipulation for that.
Actually, yeah, but it's pretty much the only one.
But it's really limited from the investigation side. But the panic mechanic, absolutely. Like, I mean, if you're running a one-shot, you've gone to a haunted house, or, you know, there's the classic module where there's a Shoggoth in the walls, which is in the older versions of Cthulhu.
Yeah, I think I know which one you mean, but I'm not going to spoil it.
Yeah, so that one, you know, sure, you could run the Alien mechanic. But once again, I think that you've got the opposite problem with Alien. You might crash and burn too quickly.
Yeah, okay. That can happen, especially when you start shooting each other.
Yeah, well, that's right. You've got the cascade, right? So you've got the cascade effect in Alien where everyone's rolling panic dice and then suddenly everyone's rolling panic dice again. And it's contributive. So I think you could do it. I would probably just tend away for it for the more investigative style Cthulhu stuff.
Brings us to Bruce's idea here of saying, could you do a Blade Runner conversion?
Actually, I don't know a lot about... I've not run Blade Runner, so I probably need to take the fifth.
I think...
You've run Blade Runner, though.
I've run Blade Runner a few times, and I'm actually trying to write my own case file as well and run it, but I need some people to run it with. I think it's very different because you've got the replicants in it, and a lot of certainly what it's aiming at is this philosophical questions. How do we actually treat replicants, and how do we make the micro decisions every day of our service lives, if you like to say, this is how they're going to be treated, and these are the rights they have or they don't have, and this is how we try to address the injustice. It's more focused on that, and of course there's a lot of investigation, but a lot of that is because you're part of a police organization. You can actually just phone in and have a lot of resources at your disposal, and the typical Cthulhu investigator doesn't have that. You have to have the skills within the group. So I think it's quite different from just looking at dice rolling, like the step dice mechanic, rather than having a dice pool with d6s. I think that could work, but I think the games are quite a long way from each other. And was something else you said. Do you think Coriolis would work?
I mean, if you're doing a kind of horror in space campaign, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Just you don't actually have anything like mental conditions, do you?
No.
You've got mind points, but that's about it.
Yeah, so you don't have conditions. The push mechanic would be weird to use
pray to the icons.
Cthulhu-esque. Well, that's the thing, right? So the icons.
Pray to the elder gods.
Yeah, exactly. I think it would be so, but I think. Sorry, I keep on saying I think. One comment though is the Cthulhu materials really good and really readily rebadged for a whole stack of purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we're talking about retrofitting the game system into the modules to run the modules as they're written, then probably not. But and I was going to make this, I explicitly have it right. So Doors to Darkness, my chance to put up a book.
Ah, very nice.
I have used this book for modules for Forbidden Lands, for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Like I've rebadged the modules completely to run them in other systems, and I've just set them right. So you can. So a lot of the material, particularly the good Chaosium material, is really, really, really good.
Yes.
And so like it's next level, best work.
Some of the research they've done is just amazing.
Well, and they also write, like some of them, like everything, it's hit and miss a bit, but like they know how to write a really good module really well, and you can repurpose the material quite readily to other settings. These introductory modules, for instance, are almost all rebadgeable to one or more settings pretty readily. Like I can imagine there's one in here which features, without giving any spoilers away, an iceberg. But you could run a whole Cthulhu. Sorry, not Cthulhu. My apologies. You could run that module in Coriolis and just have it be a mining station or an asteroid. Same logic. You could do it for Alien. Do you know what I mean? Like, you could take everything that's in here as content and just with a couple of quick flicks, flip it around and make it work for another setting.
I thought the same of Dying Ship, for example, in Coriolis Adventure. Could easily put that somewhere else. Different setting, works the same way. Alien would work really well. There's a lot of things 100%. you can steal from that. Yeah. I mean, one question here, again, from the person I'm not supposed to say the name 3 times off, was about darkness points. I think that's going to lead us slightly away. I think darkness, from my opinion, my darkness points, I do like them as a mechanic, but you do have to be inventive. So it's not just like, oh, I've got another 25 darkness points, what am I going to do with them? So there is a supplement somebody put out. Michael Marsback, I think, put that out. Eternal Lurks the Darkness.
Uses. Yeah, the creative use of darkness points one.
And it's got some good ideas.
I've run Emissary Lost, the first campaign.
Yeah, me too.
And I will just say, at one point in that campaign, the characters had 25 darkness points accumulated. I had been pretty rubbish about spending them. And I blew up an antimatter mine on the ground because they had come up with a plan and it took out a large chunk of something. And I've been through all the
darkness. It was a town, wasn't it?
Actually, yeah, it was a town. I'm trying not to give any details away, but yes, it was a town. A town where they'd made some friends, actually, and were allying with some people, and then they blew them up with a mine, and it was all very bad. I don't love darkness points very much, but only because I reckon GMs just do what darkness points tell you to do anyway. So.
Yeah. It's a little bit like threat and momentum in some 2d20 rolls. It feels like the momentum in Conan. We played Conan not long ago. And that worked quite nicely because you sort of bounce off each other. But I think they work better in Conan, for example, than they work in Star Trek. And
yeah,
does Dune have them? I can't remember. You're a Dune expert, aren't you?
Yeah. So it has them in Dune. It has them in Achtung Cthulhu as well.
Say that again.
My only Achtung Cthulhu. Thank you. Whatever. Let's not get into my lack of German pronunciation.
Yeah.
In my defense, I'm learning a Romance language, so
Yeah, good. By the way, speaking of funny pronunciations, if you want to actually see us in action playing this, and Thomas running the Vaesen rule set for Harlem Unbound, we have, I think, what is it now? We've got 3 scenarios behind us.
Yeah, and I've done a 4th one on top of that, so yeah, I'm at 4.
And we're currently working on the fourth one, and that's called that Jazz Craze, I think it is, isn't it?
Yes, the Jazz Craze.
Yeah, which is really good. And we were actually very happy and very starstruck, certainly I was, to have Chris Spivey pop into the stream at one point to have a look at it.
And make us all feel very, are we doing it right?
Yes, but he didn't. He just said he was having a nice time listening to it, so he didn't say anything. You're playing it wrong. So we've got the official stamp of approval. You are allowed to use the Vaesen Rules set to play this, which is always good. One of the things I have tried to run, but I didn't want to run on Call of Cthulhu. Main Cthulhu is this one here. Call of Cthulhu Berlin and the Wicked City. And I ran the first case of this one using Trail of Cthulhu. And I think we mentioned it earlier, the fighting, once we hit a fight, basically the whole thing, the whole tension went out, because it's like, oh, how does this work? How does that work? And yeah, you cost this much damage, still standing. And you just flipped into this combat mode, which I really don't want to have in my horror games. Do you think Vaesen can do that better, or does that better?
I think it does. I actually just legitimately think it does. I think it is a really simple system for combat. Like the simplest, possibly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably the simplest out except for Things from the Flood, of any combat system in the Year Zero space that I'm aware of. And to your exact point, you don't want to spend a lot of time worrying about fighting mechanics. It's pretty, it's still surprisingly deadly. So I think Vaesen can be very deadly very quickly, because you can go, you can rack up the conditions really quickly and then you're broken. Which is not quite the same thing as dead, but it certainly doesn't put you in a good place if the monster's still alive when that happens. And certainly through the 2.5, whatever, that we've played so far, you've had, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, you've had 2 combats in the first module. The second module, which we just got through, was a bit more combat-y.
Yeah, very memorable.
But even then, it was mostly environmental damage, almost, in a sense. Like, you couldn't do very much about the guys with the guns. They were just shooting at you, and you just had to kind of minimize the damage. And then in this, one, whatever, that we're running. So I don't think combat's a big part of the system, because I think combat is brutal and deadly, and you spend a lot of time trying to avoid being in too much of it.
Yeah. Yeah, combat is deadly.
Vaesen lets you not spend a lot of energy on working out how the combat's going to work.
Which then also puts them more into the narrative realm rather than numbers.
Yeah.
So you say, okay.
I think that's also aesthetically how we run it, right? Like, that's how everyone plays it. No one's interested in the complexities of combat in the group that we're playing. I mean, if we had someone who was really into the sort of, but I want to get advantage on this guy, I want to be here and I want to do this, then obviously the combat system's not going to feed that need.
No, it's not designed to. Did you homebrew?
You're probably in the wrong game if that's what you're looking at.
Did you homebrew anything from the chat? Another question from Mr. B.
Anything?
I guess
really? I mean,
a scenario. Did you write a new scenario? I know you converted the monsters, and you said basically don't convert, just start from scratch on the monsters, right?
Yeah. There's no mechanical, it's really fascinating. It's kind of aesthetically the same as not putting a picture of the Cthulhu monster in front of the players. Have you heard this?
Yeah.
The guy from Toa Tabletop, Mud and Blood, talked about this on one of their podcasts once, which I really thought was a really good point, which is the whole point of Cthulhu is it's all a bit sort of describe the monster and then let the players fill in the gaps, right?
It's uncertain, yeah.
Yeah,
creating those gaps for the player's imagination.
Don't shove a picture in front of them, give them the hints and the edges of the monster, and then let's see where they go. So for monster creation, I just read what the monster's meant to be able to do, and then I rebuild it in Vaesen. I don't.
And you don't do monster attack tables or anything, do you? You just narratively decide what the monster's going to do.
Yeah, so I like the mechanics of things like Trollcraft in Vaesen, because it's basically a point and shoot kind of framework for magical abilities.
Can you explain a bit more about Trollcraft? Because not everybody might be familiar with that.
So I'm not the world's biggest genius on this, but I like. So you've got cursing, trollcraft, and enchantment. Enchantment is the broad brushstrokes of environmental effect. So the players effectively experience an enchantment, but they can't resist an enchantment for all intents and purposes. Cursing is what it sounds like. So I can, curse people with various things. I like Trollcraft because it kind of gives you the magical abilities effect that you're looking for out of Call of Cthulhu land. Also, explicitly it calls upon resistances, so it's an explicitly resistible ability set, and it's usually quite focused and targeted. So the way you describe Trollcraft is you say the monster can do this thing, and this is what it is. Now, to date, we haven't, in the modules that we've run, really had... No, we've not had a real sort of giant Cthulhu monster with lots of sort of supernatural ability. So it's not really come up. Although in the first module, we had the guys who were throwing Cthulhu magic around, which I used Trollcraft to do. So that's what killed Muhammad's character.
Sorry.
Sorry, Muhammad. Was a spell. I can't remember which one it was. I think it was the horrible sort of dust one, or was it the rat one? Anyway, whichever one it was, it killed him. It was a long time ago now, actually. Now I think about it, was probably almost a year ago.
And you can still watch it on YouTube, I think.
You can still watch it on YouTube. So I really think Trollcraft was just the best mechanical way of sort of getting the Cthulhu effects. Mind you, I do like... I mean, this is the whole thing, right? Like, you're crafting a module that's already written, so you don't want to invest 72 hours in designing exactly the monster. There's a good write-up in the zine that just got published, not to self-promote, but
no,
actually...
please do promote it, because I think it's worthwhile that people know about this.
But the Vaesen zine that just got dropped by the guys, Thomas, another priest who's into Vaesen, just saying, that's a growing Venn now. Pointing at one of the people on the chat.
I'm not sure he's still there. Or still listening, at least.
But they've got this whole write-up of how you can tackle designing a Vaesen from scratch, and all the different ways you could try and attack it. I actually quite liked it. I read it. I thought it was really good. It's pretty, sort of, these are the things you can think about as opposed to a mechanical way of doing it. But that's exactly how it should be with Vaesen. So I think that was really well done. And it's on DTRPG. Yes.
It is. Alongside a supplement you wrote on Japanese Vaesen.
That's right.
Which is probably taking us away from the topic of the chat a little bit.
Yeah.
But really
the
good.
Vaesen piece,
I had the privilege of playing it a couple of times, and for whatever reason, I always end up playing doctors when I play with you.
That's true.
I don't know why.
Yeah, because you were the quite New World Doctor, as I recall. Were you the New World Doctor, or were you? Yeah, you were. Because
I was the old Doctor.
Oh.
Oldie worldy Doctor.
Oh, you were the oldie worldy Doctor.
Yes,
okay.
Pretty sure.
Go back and rewatch it. It's been a while.
Yeah. Mohammed says, hopefully his death was a heroic death. I think it was.
It was. Someone else got hung for arson, so that was a bleak ending to a great module. What else should we quickly mention?
Let me have a look at your notes again.
Sanity, fear to sanity.
Yeah.
The one thing I will say, and this is just how I've been doing it, is fear is the critical mechanic in Vaesen that you need to pay attention to. And it's, as we've already discussed, the colliery. So I tend to go with 1 fear for anything that's up to and including a D6 of sanity loss. And I tend to go to 2 fear for anything up to a D20. And then we've not had anything sort of above that. So
not yet, no. D100 or whatever.
Yeah, it's like, it's Cthulhu. Yeah, okay. Well,
you go, Matt.
4 fear. Let's see how you roll.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of what the effect is meant to represent, right? So I guess that's the thing, is how quickly do you crash and burn to broken? And the only comment and the reason I tend with fear being a little bit probably less impactful than sanity, because a lot of characters, a D6 Sanity actually does risk putting them in Cthulhu land. They'd be 10% of their Sanity, which I think has particular
that triggers something,
effects.
Madness.
Is because you also push out of the conditions. So often characters aren't sitting at max condition. You're not dealing with a character with 4 conditions to burn. So fear has to be balanced against the mechanics of the system and the way it uses pushes. So you don't need fear to be for fear, I guess is my point.
No, fear can be quite deadly. I mean, surprisingly so, actually, because it's Forbidden Lands, which works a bit differently with the attributes, of course, rather than conditions. But I recently was playing a long-running campaign, and session 26, they encountered a Hydra, and they had to do a fear roll. And somebody didn't make it, was broken on empathy, because I think he only has 2 empathy, or he was previously slightly damaged on empathy. And then, roll your mental crit, and it was a 66. Like, oh well, heart attack, but he had lucky, so he got out of it somehow. But
I'm just gonna re-roll that.
It does. He re-rolled it, but yeah, it was the 3rd time he actually used the talent to escape this deadly thing. But early on, I think in my second or third game with this group, we were in Weatherstone, the Harpies game, and they do a sort of area of effect fear attack. The whole group was broken in one attack. Every single.
And I think that could happen very easily.
It could happen here as well, yeah. Especially if people are slightly down on, as you say, on a condition.
Exactly.
And they get a fear 2 or something, and they don't have anything to defend with. Then they can actually get broken quite quickly.
So I think that...
I've got a big question here.
Okay.
You still up for it?
I was going to go to something really simple, like how you might roll out with skills, but sure. Let's do the big question, which I can't see.
All right. No, you can if you look at Twitch, you know. Could you explore other settings from Cthulhu, such as Children of Fear or the Orient Express? They seem ripe for the taking.
So I think Children of Fear is a really good question. So I bought it a couple of weeks ago and read it kind of a couple of weeks ago. So you explicitly just think, wow, could I run Children of Fear using the Vaesen? I think all the side adventures in Children of Fear would be perfect for Vaesen. They're all pretty much cultural supernatural stories. They're not mostly kind of Cthulhu. Like anyway, I don't want to give any spoilers, but there's a really cute one. It's actually kind of cute. In almost the first town you encounter. It's a very Vaesen adventure.
You'd like this guy in my background here.
No, more like what do they call the little people? The Fetin.
Fetia.
Fetia. Yeah. So anyway, it's not the same. I'm not giving any spoilers away, but it's got a similar sort of vibe, right? So that would be a brilliant Vaesen module. Like it would just fit. You wouldn't have to do anything. Like you just have to make the little monster up and the monsters up, and then you'd be done, right? And the way you solve the problem is also very Vaesen. Very Vaesen. So there's a bunch of that going on the sides. I think the core adventure to Children of Time is probably more challenging. It could still be done with Vaesen.
Because it's got the mythos, and as soon as it goes deep into the mythos, it's harder to deal with. I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's this. No. So I'm trying not to give any spoilers away, but at the end of the day, I'll just be brutal. Actually, the core campaign didn't resonate with me. Actually, was probably my real problem. I'm sure you could do it in Vaesen. Like it's still pretty supernaturally as opposed to super mythosy. The bad guy / good guy dynamic sitting in the background of all of it obviously draws heavily from Cthulhu, but actually there's nothing in it that wouldn't work for a Vaesen style story. There are forces at work in the module that are not necessarily evil. So it does have a bit of that Vaesen vibe. You can work through that part of the core campaign using a kind of Vaesen, how do we find our way through kind of story.
Yeah.
there's still a big bad guys. I just didn't
And
quite work.
Orient Express, have you played that?
No. A funny story I was reading about it. I was actually thinking about reading it, downloading it yesterday, like buying it and reading it, because I was actually looking at it.
In my local club here, they play that a lot.
Apparently, yes.
Hmm.
Apparently, it would work for Vaesen, though. From what little I was able to read,
All right.
the episodic nature, the fact that, as I understand it, a number of the conflicts that occur through the day-to-day running are not necessarily Cthulhu-y.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand there are some encounters that specifically are not Cthulhu-y. I would imagine the answer is yes. I don't know how you'd go at the ultimate thing, because have you done it? Is that what you were saying?
No, I haven't played it, but at my Milton Keynes role-playing club here, they're going to run a con soon again. A little plug for them, MKRPG, if you want to look it up. They often have a game going of the Orient Express one. And I think one just concluded, and they're just about to start the next crew. And actually, we have this sort of claim to fame that one of the guys who wrote 7th edition, and also who wrote Rivers of London, Paul Fricker, he used to come to the club. He sometimes still does, but he actually ran a game of Cthulhu with me in it. That was quite cool. So I've got my rule book signed by him as well. But yeah.
Oh, very nice.
It is very nice. But yeah, they all love this, and they say this must be one of the best, if not the best. The masks is supposed to be really good as well. And then, of course, if you go slightly more pulpy, which Vaesen might not be the best for, well, maybe it does work, actually, is the two-headed serpent. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah, so I was looking at campaigns yesterday for exactly that reason, right? If I was going to do a long campaign, and that's why I got Children of Time.
Yeah.
Was imagining running a long span Vaesen. And obviously it's set in sort of Far East Asia through to Central Asia and then into India.
Okay.
So it's got a really interesting kind of cultural background. Mm-hmm. It's full of cultural detail, so much cultural detail. It's very Cthulhu Chaosium. Well, it's very Chaosium, actually, is probably the thing. Mm-hmm. And look, I should probably, when I wrote the Japanese Vaesen thing, I was probably more heavily influenced by the way Chaosium writes their historical material than I was by the way Vaesen writes historical material.
Yeah, okay, you can see that. I could see that in the material as well, yeah.
Yeah, I'm way more into that side of the equation. Like, I'm a bigger fan of that. I don't know. Did that answer the question? Yeah,
I think it did. Yeah, I mean, I think just to top that off with the Wicked City Berlin, I think that would work quite nicely. And there is a backdrop which is super mythos, if you like, but you could actually leave that away or disguise it. There's so much on the human scale going on, and on the slightly supernatural side that you can just say, yeah, that works for Vaesen as well. So I'm also, I mean, I'm always, my eyes are always bigger than my stomach or my calendar anyway. I always fancy playing another campaign, for example, Eternal Lies, which is the big Trail of Cthulhu campaign, and possibly doing that on the Vaesen rule set. That could be quite cool as well.
Yeah, and there's some older ones, right? So there's Yog-Sothoth and some of those older ones. I guess this touches on, it's a good way to segue though into probably one. I think there are things that don't work in the Vaesen setting.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are things that explicitly just aren't suitable. And I think those more sort of world-ending horror sort of stories, probably less good. And apparently that is a thing about some of the big campaigns is you know, they're really trying to get you to that point that you reach the end and it's all bleak and the characters go mad and, you know, the universe ends kind of thing. They would not suit Vaesen at all.
Yeah. Like
in no way, shape or form would they suit the Vaesen system. That's not a judgment on those modules. It's to say Vaesen would be exactly the wrong way to tackle that content.
Yeah. Reluctant Artsy is saying, after reading a quarter of Orient Express, the setting seems to work really well for Vaesen. And he's considering a steamer ship transatlantic voyage setting. Don't know whether you've watched, I think it's called 1899.
Yeah, I haven't watched it, but I'm aware of it. It was
It's
done by the same
really-
guy who did Dark, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. There's really, really strange thing about going across, apparently, the Atlantic and then encountering all sorts of weird shenanigans. And when I was watching that, I thought, this could make a really good scenario if I only understood what was actually going on in the film. I didn't quite understand that series, but it was really moody and interesting.
So to test my thesis, one thing that I did get yesterday from drive-through, because it was pretty cheap, was the Yellow King, Tatters of the King. Tatters of the King.
Uh-huh.
Which is very much a Hasta story, obviously. You can get that message straight from that headline.
Is this a Call of Cthulhu one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the Yellow King
Yeah.
by Pellegrine. Don't they do the Yellow King?
Yeah, they do the Yellow King RPG. I wish I've got.
Yeah.
The King in Yellow, I think it's actually called.
Oh, sorry.
Yellow King? Oh, no, actually it's called the Yellow King RPG. I think that's right. And I really like that RPG. Yeah, it's sort of a little bit like Swords of the Serpentine in the way it approaches it. But the one thing that I didn't like about it is how they manage conditions. So essentially you can have 3 conditions before, essentially. There's minor and major ones. But that seemed quite similar. But then they have, and I've got the decks of cards up there, it's about 500 cards with different conditions.
Okay.
Whether they're mental or whether they're physical. And basically the monsters cause different ones, and then they stack differently, and they have got a condition to get rid of them again. And I just thought the sort of neat approach of having very quick combat in that game, where you just say, okay, we just run through this and everybody makes the call, the decision, we roll a die, we interpret it, and at the end you know what the outcome is after one round of any combat, really. Then gets complicated with having all these cards for the conditions. They're not all relevant for all the settings, I have to say, because they've got different timescales that hang together. In the Yellow King, they've got the 1890s roughly, or 1870s. Then they've got the alternate war, the Great War, and then they've got the new normal, which is our time, but in a different timeline. And across those 3, they pan out a bit because you have different skills sometimes and so on. So it's a really interesting role-playing game. But the one thing where I actually tripped over it, and I was running it for a stream in Germany, was how to handle the conditions. So I made a spreadsheet of it. So I could easily track and just key in the number of the condition, and then we could always see which conditions were currently active or not. But that sort of overhead, I don't want that in my horror role-playing games.
And this is probably the whole thing, right? It's avoiding the overheads that's really driving a lot of this behavior, because we're lazy. But it is actually the most important thing. So I'm just conscious of time. So maybe...
Yeah, we're going to finish up in a minute or 2.
Well, no, all I was going to say is I'll just smash through the only other thing I was going to mention, which is, look, obviously you do face a challenge when you take a Cthulhu module, which does have, 50, 60 skills, and you run it down to 12. So I guess the only thing I wanted to say about that is you can just hand wave it. Don't even think hard about it, right? Like, so the science skills tend towards learning. Do that and you're fine. Observation handles all of the reading people skills. Vigilance handles all the alertnessy type things, so the listen checks and the things. And investigation skill handles all of the clue forensic-y stuff that isn't already addressed by the learning thing, depending on how you want to do it. So mechanically, it's interesting because actually you could argue, and probably can indeed argue, that Vaesen investigation skill, that core skill, doesn't actually naturally marry to anything directly in Call of Cthulhu, because you've got forensics, but forensics is still a learning skill, right? Like, it's the science of forensics. It's not, and you know, you detect things like you know, the guy who left his, you know, the horrible monster that left its clawed footprint in the garden just outside the window, through sort of, you know, your visual, you know, sight skills. So I just make the point that you just glad-hand it, right? Don't try and do some complicated mapping. Just go, I reckon that's a learning roll. I reckon that's and just move on.
And it keeps the game flowing as well, which I like. Yeah, because somebody is bound to have that skill. Bruce here, for example, says you will, even though there's a long list of skills in Cthulhu, you don't use a lot of them very often at all. Yeah,
which is the weakness of that kind of mechanic, right?
Yeah.
And what, to go right back to the beginning, and the other problem is you end up in a scenario where you do need that one very obscure skill and no one has it. Or they have it at 10% and then you're stuffed.
But if you've got a well-prepared GM, they would know before that and have come up with an alternative plan.
They might have, for instance, say, I'd really make sure you take this skill, just saying.
Yeah,
Put that one
just saying. But we were talking right at the beginning of this about the gated information, that you need clues. And basically the Trail of Cthulhu approach to that is basically make sure that you always get the key clues. Don't hide them behind a roll. Yeah, even if you pretend it's hidden behind a roll, just find a way of providing it anyway.
And it's interesting because the way they handled that was they created a mechanical way of addressing that problem, right? So the investigative skill pool is that's right. Is explicitly how you get around that. When I'm running an investment, I just don't hide the clues that you should be able to find.
You don't have to have a mechanic for it. You just know this is an important clue. You'll have it.
You'll need this to move the narrative forward. Here's this thing. What I do take on board from Trail of Cthulhu and absolutely do apply here is you give the person the amount of detail they need to progress to the next phase of the module. But what I like about Trail of Cthulhu, and I should make the point, I really do like the investigative system in Trail of Cthulhu, is the idea of additional insight. So you've got the bare minimum to get you to the next one, but what if you actually want to know a lot more about what's going on? Because that'll help frame how you approach the next bit.
Yeah, you get more clues, you get something extra. Exactly.
Yeah, so that's that. So I do like that, and I do definitely use the Vaesen skill rolls to achieve that outcome. So you might have enough to get onto, but do you know the full context of what your understanding is? No. So you could crash in as opposed to creep in.
Yeah, Bruce says, go with a phrase that pays. Somebody says, oh, I'm looking in that cupboard. And then you say, yeah, you find it. Or, I'm looking through the flat. What can I find? Rather than just saying, oh, I'm using my forensics to look at the fingerprints on the cutlery or whatever. So, good. Now, last call for any questions from the chat. I think this was a really nice way of exploring this a little bit. From a player's perspective, I have to say, you make the Harlem Unbound stories really easy and really enjoyable. I never feel like the system is getting in the way. And for me, that's a big hallmark to just say, it must be working. Oh, you make it work anyway. So that was really good to be able to explore that a little bit today, and might inspire some people here. It might help some people, whether they're here live or whether they watch it a bit later. So spread the news, If you like Free League, you can still play Cthulhu campaigns, publish materials while we wait for the Free League Call of Cthulhu game, if and when that comes. Is it Coriolis cookbook yet out yet?
Oh, don't. I have a whole stack of Persian and Mezarab, so North African cookbooks.
Yeah, so you don't need the Coriolis one. It's just a running joke.
Coriolis cookbook. It is very sad. Cool. So I guess the final message from me, just to say it, would be: you don't have to choose. You can buy both Free League and Chaos and material. It's perfectly fine.
Yeah, and the materials are really good. Yeah,
they're really good.
Like the Berlin stuff here. Okay, there are a couple of things where, as a German, I say that's not quite right, but I know that some of the writers certainly spend a lot of time in Berlin or living in Berlin. And it's a really lovely thing as well, this book here. Especially if you like Babylon Berlin. That for me was the inspiration, the TV series. To get back into this one and just say, it's such an interesting time in German history.
I love the Weimar Republic. Weimar Republic? Weimar Republic?
Weimar Republic, yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's an amazing period of history.
It is. It is full of political conflict, full of social change. It's really interesting, really fascinating. I really dived into that when I was running this, but I only run one scenario, and then decided, nah, Call of Cthulhu doesn't quite work for it yet. So I think I'm going to do it with
Run it
Weimar.
with Vaesen.
I will try Vaesen and Weimar rather than Harlem. So I think we got a couple of nice comments here. Great work, keep it up, it says. Very well done. Check out the content that is on DriveThru that we mentioned. I might put some links, if I remember, down here for the Vaesen magazine.
Is nice. And it's pretty cheap. So.
Yeah. How much is it? Do you know? $5 or something?
Having just bought it, I should know, shouldn't I? Hold on.
You probably bought it with credits, didn't you?
Well, anyway, $5. $5.
That's what I estimated. Good. So that's definitely worthwhile for nice zine, and I think it's a good. I think they're aiming for a quarterly release of it. And
that's right.
They just announced the next Vaesen Con as well. So if you want to know more about that, either let me know or search the internets. There's a Discord for organizing the next Vaesen Con as well. Right. Yeah. Well, I'm going to say goodbye to the chat then, and to the stream. I'm just under an hour. I think we are good in the time. May all your pushes succeed, right?
Except for the ones that the GM wants you to fail.
They wouldn't. MGM's always nice people. I'll say goodbye now.
Bye.